Welcome to the next video. We're going to see how Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, left authorship clues in these works of William Shakespeare. This is a screenshot from Alexander Waugh's video, John Weaver New Part 1. It's an example of a code from a poem first published in 1606, where Waugh explains how Penelope Rich, the Countess of Devonshire's name, is spelled using the poem's capital letters. Notice how most of it, like the name Penelope, appears along the left margin, what's referred to as an acrostic. The same idea is here. I've gone over this before in other videos, but I'm going to show something after which helps prove my claim that Edward de Vere's name is being spelled at the beginning of Venus and Adonis. In case you haven't seen me explain this, if you look at the opening page and read the first letters along the left margin, they spell E-V-H-R-H. To read the name, you have to understand that codes in Shakespeare sometimes use Greek letters that resemble letters from the Latin or English alphabets. For example, in Greek, a lowercase o, omega, looks like a small w, and a Greek letter r, or rho, looks like a letter p. And in classical and Koine Greek, the language of the New Testament, the letter eta looks like a capital H and a lowercase n, and was used for the long vowel e. Apply that the classical Greek long vowel E looks like a letter H, and the letters E-V-H-R-H spell E for Edward, V-E-R-E for Vere. Just like how the name Penelope is found at the beginning of that other poem, we find Edward de Vere's name at the beginning of Venus and Adonis. It makes sense that an author who couldn't sign his work would figure out a way to include his name somewhere. It would be too obvious for Edward de Vere to spell his name the way I'm showing it on the screen now, so he used the simple and clever way of spelling it with a Greek letter, printing his name along the left margin in the opening stanza. The second work published under the name William Shakespeare was Lucrece, and a recent discovery by fellow researcher Patrick Jennings helps prove not only that this is a work by Edward de Vere, but that he was using the Greek alphabet in the way I just explained. Since de Vere was the 17th Earl of Oxford, the number 17 often factors into the way a code is found. For example, Patrick counted the first 17 lines of the poem and discovered this acrostic. Taking a closer look, line 17 begins with double V followed by the letters IR. Edward de Vere sometimes signed his name double V from the French word for W, W. Also in French, the number 2 is pronounced de. 2V in English is de ve, which sounds like de vie, the first letters of de Vere. Double V might also be reflected in de Vere's family motto, Vero nihil verius, where ver, which sounds like Vere, and is the root word for truth, appears twice. Initially, when Patrick sent me this, we thought that by spelling the word Vere with 2 V's, it was hinting at the name de Vere. However, a W is comprised of 2 characters, and if we only read the first characters along the acrostic, it simply spells Vere, V-I-R. Now notice the typesetting. Following the letter I is a lowercase n, and they're typeset just beneath and above the V and R. Recall earlier when I explained how, in classical Greek, the letter eta, used for the long vowel E, looks like a capital letter H and a lowercase n. That's what's going on here. The N beneath the V in Vere is also meant to be read as a Greek eta, meaning a letter E. Just like how the E Vere acrostic in Venus and Adonis is spelled with a letter that looks like a Greek uppercase eta, the word Vere is being spelled in Lucrece on line 17 with a lowercase eta, which looks similar to a letter N. V-I lowercase eta R is also pronounced Vere. Vere, spelled V-I-E-R in Dutch and German, is the number 4. The reason Edward de Vere is spelling the number 4 along with his name is because if we keep reading downwards along the margin, the next letter is O. Vere O is 4O, which is 40. If you follow these videos or Alexander Waugh's, you know the number 40 often appears with the de Vere Shakespeare codes. Sometimes we find references to 4T or 4th T, and often find the number 1740, a number we learn from law that's associated with Edward de Vere. To review, beginning on line 17 of Lucrece, read the first characters along the margin and we get the spelling of Vere. Include the lowercase letter that falls within the typesetting of these characters along the margin, and they spell Vere-O, meaning 40. We know 17 stands for Oxford's Earl number, but we're not exactly sure of the meaning of 40. Some, like fellow researcher Chris Johnson, believe Edward de Vere was the 40th monarch of England, and that 1740 are his Earl and monarchal numbers. Maybe it's only a meaningless coincidence, but Patrick Jennings counted the words of this stanza with the Vere acrostic, and the 40th word is kings. And looking back at the beginning of Venus and Adonis, just beneath the E Vere acrostic, I noticed there are two T's followed by the letters SM. A T is a cross, a symbol for God, and the first T begins the word thrice, meaning 3, the number of the Trinity, which can be written out as 3-letter T's, for God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Add thrice or 3 T's to the T printed beneath, and along the acrostic we have 4T. Beneath that, SM might stand for the Latin abbreviation Sacra Majestas, meaning Sacred Majesty, which is used to refer to God or as a title for a monarch. Now, possible allusions to Edward de Vere or 40 being some kind of king aside, later in the poem, something I'm sure that is not a coincidence and is a clue that Edward de Vere was William Shakespeare is found on page 24, line 495. I'm not exactly sure who first discovered this, but I've recently figured out one more detail that helps confirm this is de Vere hinting at his name. Homophones are words that sound the same, and a homophone of de Vere's is made when the word and brings deaf and hears together, resulting in deaf ears. Will is deaf ears is telling us that will is de Vere's. Some might roll their eyes at that play on words, but let me explain why it stands out. Like I mentioned earlier, Edward de Vere sometimes signed his name Double V, a play on the French word for W, double. I went through the poem, and in over 1,800 lines of text, I found that the W beginning the word will is the only example of a double V character that isn't printed at the start of a line. The double V character appears many times throughout the lines of the poem, but always as the first letter. It's only when we get the words will is deaf and hears when it doesn't. It's not a coincidence that Edward de Vere referred to himself as Double V, and the only example of double V in the poem that isn't the first letter at the beginning of a line is found spelling the word will, followed by a homophone of de Vere's. Something else is, this is the only time in the poem where the words rows and crosses appear on the same page. In fact, these two words are in the same stanza as will is deaf ears. Maybe that's a coincidence, maybe not. And I don't want to make a big deal of it, but looking back to the first page of Venus and Adonis where the E Vere acrostic is found, counting the words from the start of the poem, the 17th word is rose-cheeked. Christopher Marlowe used the same words to describe Adonis in one of his works, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll see that the word check is a variant of cheek, and the words checked and crossed mean the same thing. So if check is a variant of cheek, and checked means crossed, could rose-cheeked be alluding to rose-crossed, chosen with intent to be the 17th word by Edward de Vere, with the Vere acrostic and rose sharing the same letter R, to show a connection between him and the fraternity of the Rosy Cross. To be clear, I'm not saying that the word should definitely be translated the way I'm presenting it here. I just found it interesting when I went on the OAD website and saw how one word might imply the other. And we do have to be careful with things like this because it runs the risk of a lot of words becoming more significant than they're meant to be, and then you start finding codes and messages everywhere. The same goes for numbers. Now these other things I've gone over I believe are legitimate codes. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote under the pseudonym William Shakespeare and included spellings of his name in his first 2 published works. Something else that I think confirms what I'm showing is legit is that this is the same information we find in the Sonnets dedication. The dedication is printed in 3 inverted triangles comprised of 6, 2, and 4 lines. 624 or June 24th was the day Edward de Vere died, according to history. John Rolette discovered that if we read every 6th, 2nd, and 4th word of the dedication, we get the message, "These sonnets all by Ever the 4th T." Ever, or E. Vere, is a short form of Edward Vere. And here, just like in Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, he's being referred to as the number or title, the 4th T, or 4T. This is not happening without design. One more thing I want to say about the dedication is that in previous videos I've shown how Vince Galloway figured out that when the first and last letters of the opening lines are read, they spell TT map by DSF. The TT map refers to certain details on the cover and the Cardano grid the dedication makes when it's written into 19 columns. The details on the cover and rebuses in the grid tell us the exact location of Edward de Vere's grave. I'll explain by Alexander Waugh in his video, Where is Shakespeare Really Buried? Previously I've said that SF might stand for sub-phenum, meaning at the end, suggesting this was something D was working on towards the end of his life. But I recently learned that SF also stands for Servitor Fidelis, meaning faithful servant, and I think that's more likely the answer. So is D being a faithful servant to God, or, as it is in monarchies, a faithful servant to a king, like Ever the 4th T? Now, what about the first folio? Shouldn't there be something about Edward Vere and the number 40 there? If you count the words right to left from the end of the poem, the 17th word is Ever. 17 is Edward de Vere's Earl number, and like with the Sonnets dedication, Ever is a short form of Edward Vere. Notice how Ever is printed in between 2 words spelled with double V. Keep counting, and 40 words from Ever is the name Shakespeare. Now this has been known for some time, and maybe Alexander Waugh first discovered it, I'm not sure, but I figured out something recently that I think lets us know this is a work by 40. Along the left margin is this acrostic of letters. I think it's a kind of puzzle that's meant to be worked out partially using gematria, where letters are equivalent to numbers. We have the word two, TWO, followed by a comma, separating it from the letters HB. Most of the codes in Shakespeare that use gematria use the 23-letter Latin alphabet. John Dee refers to both gematria and this alphabet in his work Monos Hieroglyphica. As you can see, the letter H is equal to 8, and the letter B is equal to 2. The word 2 is like a command telling us to apply it to everything that follows 2 times. For example, we just saw that H is equal to 8. That means that 2 H's, or 8 plus 8, equals 16. B is equal to 2, so 2 B's, or 2 plus 2, is 4. 16 and 4, or 2 H's and 2 B's, is equal to 20. Now apply the word 2 to 20, and 20 plus 20 equals 40. There's nothing else to add. We've taken it as far as we can go. Now if we apply gematria to the two 20s we just added, 20 is equivalent to the letter V, resulting in double V, the name used by Edward de Vere. Maybe that's too much mathacadabra for some people, but we keep finding the same information over and over again. References to Edward Vere and the number 40, or the 4th T. One more example of this I'll share with you that I think is kind of fun and you'll enjoy is found at the end of the Sonnets Quarto in the poem entitled A Lover's Complaint. In the sonnets there are 36 words printed in italics. In A Lover's Complaint there's 1, the word allos, referring here to bitterness or painful experience. Throughout the poem, the pages are printed with the title A Lover's Complaint. Turn the page after the word aloes appears, and the poem ends on the last page of the quarto. Look at the top and you'll see that the title is misprinted. It went from A Lovers to The Lovers, an obvious mistake, and as we'll see, not one without intent. Look down the page to the last stanza and you'll see a series of letter O's, with the last O followed by the word all. All O's, get it? The word aloes is the only one italicized in the poem because someone wants us to look here. From the top of the page, beneath the misprinted word the, there are 17 lines to the fourth letter O along the left margin. 1740 is the same as 1740, Edward de Vere's number. Notice how the fourth O on line 17 falls right before all O, or all O's, as I'll refer to it, highlighted in blue. Taking a closer look at the stanza, if we count the words right to left, starting with the all in all O's, 17 words later is forced, spelled F-O-R-C''D. In French, the letter C isn't pronounced. If this word forced, spelled the way it is pronounced in French, it's Ford. You can listen to it with a translator online. Translate from French to English, typing in the word the way it's spelled in the poem, F-O-R-C''D. Hit the speaker button and you'll hear it pronounced Ford. Since the clue is that we're not pronouncing the letter C, it means we have these letters separated by an apostrophe. 4D. 4D is a homophone of 40. Starting with all in all O's, the 17th word is 4D, an allusion to Oxford's number 1740. That's the second 1740 we've found connected to all O's. The third is found by counting the words after it. From the end of the poem, starting with the word made, the 17th word falls right before all O's and is printed just beneath 4 T's. These are the three 1740s I found that appear before, after, or start with all O's, and they result with made being the last word, the 17th after all O's. Even though maid refers to a young woman, it's also a homophone and variant spelling of the word made, meaning to make, and I think this was designed so that we can figure out that the poem was made by 1740 or Edward de Vere. If you disagree with those three examples of 1740, at the very least I think you'd have to agree that the poem's title has been misprinted, and that the word aloes was italicized so that we look at all O's in the last stanza. The fourth O is on line 17, just before all O's, and 17 words after all O's is the word made. This was made by someone who uses these numbers, and who else could that have been other than the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere? And how do we know that all of these aloes is referring to Oxford, and that the poem and sonnets are his work? Because it's reflected in the italicized word itself. Aloes, or all O's, is short for all Oxfords. Since aloes is spelled with an E, it might even be an acronym for all Oxford Earls, spelled all OEs. Either way, it's the same person, Edward de Vere. I sent what I found about the aloes puzzle to Patrick Jennings, and he had the idea to count all the capital letter O's in the poem. In total, there are 40. 40 O's, all Oxfords. Once again, we have the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, connected to 40. Now this doesn't have to do with the authorship question, but it's similar to how aloes is meant to be read and lets us know who some of these sonnets are about. In Sonnet 20, the word hues is italicized, and I figured out why. The plural of the letter U is U's. Two letter U's make a W. Hues is meant to be read as HU's, an H and a couple letter U's meaning a W. In the sonnet, the fair youth is described as having a feminine appearance, and as you can see from this portrait, so did Henry Wriothesley. The word Hughes is italicized because it hints at his initials H.W. Most believe that the youth in the sonnet is Wriothesley, but I remember reading a suggestion that Hughes stood for a William Hughes, whoever that was, and it's simply not true. Hughes is H.Hughes, meaning H.W. for Henry Wriothesley. And speaking of Wriothesley, in the last video entitled Light in the Tower, I showed how I think a number referring to Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 appears 3 times on the tower portrait, and in a previous video how the same verse also appears in the sonnets 3 times as a message from the golden rosy cross. When the portrait's turned over, I explained how the clamp holding the Bible to the desk is revealed to be a 13, and how there are letters in Rosie's cloak spelling VEO, the Spanish word veo meaning I see. I also pointed out how the frame of the window makes a cross over the head of the cat, and someone who watched the video, posting under the name BLM76, noticed that the cross and the round shape of the cat's body make a reverse of the Greek letters R and T, or rho tau. What we're seeing when the portrait's turned upside down is a reversed tau symbol known as a starogram. I know the cat looks kind of funny here without her paws, but this is the shape her body and the frame are making. This symbol is believed to be used by the Rosicrucians because the Greek letter rho stands for rose, and the letter T or tau is a cross. There's a variation of the symbol which looks similar to an Egyptian ankh. It has a letter O representing the shape of a rose, offset to one side, simulating the loop made by the Greek letter rho. Every example of the Tau starogram and its circle and cross variant representing a rose and cross has appeared in a work believed to have had a connection to the Rosicrucians. In the video Oxford Kings in the Bible, I show how the variation of the symbol, with it always leaning forward, is found 3 times on the frontispiece of the 1611 King James Bible. Each example is being looked at, written, and pointed to by John the Evangelist, a patron saint of Freemasonry. I found the symbol 3 times in Shakespeare's sonnets as part of a repeating message, and on a Royal Society portrait with Francis Bacon. Some have suggested that the Shakespeare Memorial at Westminster's is a reversed Chi-Rho symbol, but I think it may be a rose and cross variant of the Tau starogram, and I'll talk about that in a future video. And on page 2 of The Tempest in the first folio, Peter Amundsen discovered that if you replace the letters OT, the shape of a rose and cross, with the letters RC, there's an acrostic that reads, Arcadia, lie there my art. I know some people don't like to hear it, but the Rosicrucians were part of the Shakespeare story, and if you're doing this kind of research, keep an eye out for this symbol. Alright, these are some of the clues that let us know William Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by Edward de Vere. Others may have used it as well, and I do believe Francis Bacon was involved at some point, and references to his name definitely appear throughout the first folio. But Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, also known as the 4th T or 4T, was William Shakespeare. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the thumbs up button, and if you have any questions or suggestions, leave them in the comments. I have a lot more I want to share, and will get it posted when I can. Thanks to Patrick Jennings, BLM76, and to you for watching. And as always, to Alexander Waugh.